Then Jesus returned to his Father and took his place of supreme authority over all created things. And actually, the first verses of Acts chapter 1, which we will get to today, is Jesus ascending, leaving earth and ascending up to heaven and taking his place at the right hand of God. So we'll be looking at that passage. Jesus then sent the Spirit to live in the hearts of his new covenant people, providing them the healing, power, guidance, and gifts necessary to be a contrast society that could reveal the kingdom of God to the world. Just as Jewish grooms would do at their betrothal ceremony, Jesus gave a gift to his bride as a promise that he would come back for her one day, the gift of the Holy Spirit. This was the beginning of the church, the new covenant community of people all over the world who followed Jesus' way of faithfulness, peace, wholeness, and justice as they shared his mission to restore the world. With the book of Acts, we'll turn to the birth of the church and that part of the story. But before we get there, we're going to be spending a little more time in the Gospels and looking at some of Jesus' teachings on the kingdom that we didn't quite get to last time. We'll be looking at how Jesus did mission, how he sent his disciples out on mission, and what we can learn from that pattern. And then we'll look at that last final week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem as he makes the journey to Jerusalem, as he spends a week challenging the temple system, challenging the religious leaders, and eventually being crucified and rising from the dead. So where we left off last week was we had just started to look at living in the kingdom, what life in the kingdom looks like. And we had talked about this principle that agape love for each other is the primary sign of being a follower of Jesus. This is Jesus' one test he gives. Here's how you'll know my disciples. They will have agape love for one another. That leaves us with a very significant test as to how we're doing as the body of Christ. I think there's a lot of things important about being in church. I think being in church includes caring about our teachings, making sure they're biblical, being faithful to many things. But it's rare in church history that this has been what Christians have said is the most important thing. Jesus said it was the most important. But frequently, as you look at church history, it turns out that how we shape our doctrine or how we do our church services or things like this become the most important thing we worry about. But this, Jesus says, is the primary way by which the world will know we're his followers. So we have agape love for one another. This is tied then to Jesus' frequent teaching of dying to self-centeredness. Because if I'm not dying to self-centeredness, I won't be agape loving you. These come as a package deal. It requires me to die to my self-centeredness for me to love you, and vice versa. 3, the kingdom can only grow in community. Thus, the absolute necessity of the church, which is the community of God's people. I just saw a poll today. It was a George Barna poll. It was done a few years ago, but I think probably it's not that long ago where statistics have probably changed much. George Barna was polling American adults. He was asking them questions about what was most important to them in life. On this particular poll, it was 2008, 74% of people in America, American adults, said that having a relationship with God was a very important factor in their lives. Yeah, it was 74%. 60% got a little more specific and said not just a relationship with God, because that could include Islam or Buddhist or whatever, but this 60% said a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. They specified it to a Christian picture of God. But only 35% said that being active in a church was important to their lives. Which means 74% of people think that relationship with God is important, but only 45% think the church is important. And even if it's specifically Christian, 60% going, that means somewhere between 15 to 25% of American adults think something's important about God or Jesus, but not the church. And yet Jesus does not picture, like for Jesus, the idea of a personal relationship with him that doesn't include personal relationships with brothers and sisters doesn't even make sense. Yet for Americans, again, because of our individualism, we can so easily imagine just a relationship with Jesus, and if I ever get around to it, maybe I'll check a church out someday. For Jesus, community is the context in which we do kingdom life. They're intimately tied together. Jesus loves the church. He can't help it, it's his bride. What's he going to do? Fourthly, and this is where we left off last week, we talked about Jesus' constant message of keeping the kingdom holy, that is, set apart from everything else. Don't mix it in with the world. If you start mixing the church in with the world, you start mixing the kingdom in with the culture, you end up being a church that's not salt, a people that's not light. You end up putting a bushel over your lamp. That's that mixing that makes things watered down in the kingdom. Jesus says, keep the kingdom holy. You know, he says that in so many ways, right? Don't let him get caught into nationalism. He won't allow himself to get pulled into Jewish nationalistic debates. He won't allow himself to get into debates about Caesar and the temple taxes. He keeps turning the debate back on people and shining the light on their hearts. There was one time even two brothers asked him to, the two brothers were fighting over their parents' inheritance, the Gospel of Luke. They come to Jesus to settle the dispute between them. And Jesus says to them, what do I look like, your lawyer? And so he'll turn on him. I won't answer your question, but I'll tell you what I will answer. And he says, I'm not your lawyer, but here's what I will say. Beware of greed and the idolatry that comes with that. So he's constantly focusing people's worldly questions back on the kingdom heart questions. Keep the kingdom holy. Keep your heart set apart. That's where we left off last week. Fifth, and new point here, kingdom relationships are to be characterized by humility and power under servanthood. Jesus, this might be the toughest one in terms of Jesus trying to get through to his disciples. Right until the last, it seems. His disciples, his close inner 12, who he's been pouring into, mentoring, walking with, they've been watching him live life with him for 3 years. And to the end, it seems like they don't, this is so hard to get this one. To the end, you know, one or two of them will come up, like James and John, two brothers at one point, come to Jesus, 2 of the 12, and say, hey, Jesus, will you let us sit at your right and left hands when you finally come into your kingdom? It's like, yeah, those other 10 are okay, but we want to be right next to you. They can be right behind us. So put us in charge of the others, right? It's so difficult for human beings to believe that the position of being first isn't really first. So Jesus will say, no, the first shall be last. It's the last who are going to be first. Humility, what is that? One of the most absolutely essential character qualities of the kingdom is humility. Jesus said of himself, come to me and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. Those are Jesus' words about himself. Jesus was a walking example of humility. That's an important lesson to us, because sometimes we can confuse what humility is in Christian circles. We think that humility is the opposite of pride. And since we know that pride is a sort of arrogant thing, we often think that humility means thinking really lowly of yourself. Almost like a worm theology. We're so bad, right? But no, that's simply not, because if that was the case, Jesus would have thought really bad of himself. He obviously didn't. He had a very healthy sense of who he was. He was beloved Son of the Father, right? He never walks around acting like he's got a shame problem. I would put it this way. I think there's 2 forms of pride. Arrogant pride and shameful pride, which I call this reverse pride. Because what's in common about thinking too high of yourself or too low of yourself is you're thinking about yourself. You're focused on yourself. That's the human condition of sin. We focus on ourselves. And quite frankly, Satan, I don't think, cares whether we think too high of ourselves or too low of ourselves, as long as we're focused on ourselves. C.S. Lewis put it this way: you want to see a humble person? Here's how you notice a humble person. It looks like they sort of forgot about themselves. They're not walking around arrogantly. They're not walking around in shame. They're walking around focused on God and others. They seem free, really free, because they're not bound up with self-centeredness. That's humility. It's a different thing that either pride is an arrogant thing or pride is a shameful thing. It's freedom from all that. And just release to loving God and others and being focused outward. Maybe the best definition of humility I've ever heard. Dean Sherman gave this definition, longtime YWAM teacher. He said it, put it this way: humility is simply the willingness to be known for who you truly are. Not higher than you are, not lower than you are, who you truly are. And who am I truly? I'm truly whoever God says I am. I can't define myself. I can't let my mom or dad define me. I can't let my friends or my kids or my wife or my employer define me, because if any of those people define me, they're Lord of my life. The only person who can define you is your Lord. And if Jesus is your Lord, he gets to define you. And he has defined you. If you're in covenant with Jesus, you're a beloved brother of Jesus and son of his Father. You're absolutely precious and valuable. Your value's been set by Calvary. And I don't know how, if you believe that, you can think lowly of yourself. Shame is gone at that point. But neither would you think arrogantly of yourself, because you're so aware that everything you have comes as a gift. That's how you can move into humility, is you just realize God defines you as his precious child, and there's nothing to earn anymore. Nothing to be shamed about, nothing to be prideful about, just humility. God and others, focusing outward. And that puts us in a position where we can now come under people in service, as opposed to trying to come over people, to dominate and control, which usually comes out of anxiety and fear. And it's such a different way of leading. You know, this way of humility and power under leading is just not what we see in the world. Yet that's what we're called to do with each other as brothers and sisters. Anyone who's in a leadership position in the church is called to come to be known as I truly am, not more or less, and to serve as I lead, not to lead in order to be served. Jesus' words to his own disciples: the greatest in the kingdom will be the humble servant to all. That's easy to say, but then Jesus does it. Comes into that Last Supper. And none of them are thinking, because there's no servant there, none of them are thinking about the fact that we have dirty feet here, feet that should be washed. But who would lower themselves to do that? The Lord. That's Jesus. Enacts now the fact that the greatest is a servant to all as he washes his disciples' feet. Jesus' instructions now on how to do mission, kingdom mission. Fascinating set of teachings here. Twice this happens in Luke. Luke 9, when he sends the 12 out for the first time. And then Luke 10, the next chapter, when he sends 70 out. So he's growing his missionaries. And I think it's really interesting how Jesus instructs them what to do and how to do it. I think really a lot of interesting principles we can learn from. Here's the first thing. He sends them out 2 by 2. Jesus never sends a lone Christian. I don't think it's just, because they don't want to be lonely. There's a principle here. Do ministry in community. Because part of what we're sharing with people isn't simply words, it's a demonstrated type of relationship. The quality of our relationships model the reality of our message. At least that's the theory. I think that's what, if you send 2 people out at least, they have a relationship they can bring into a new context and share what agape love looks like. This is how humans are called to relate. Which means that our relationships become our message. And that raises a serious question. Is our message in line with our relationships? Are our relationships really up to the level of our message of the beauty of the agape kingdom of God? I was teaching a class I'm doing at Bethel today on covenant relationships. And a group of senior students who are graduating this year. And we're talking about friendship. And Fred Markert, who's another YWAM teacher, I heard 30 years ago, to give a teaching on friendship, and he said this thing just got me back then. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something to this effect. He said, the measure of our spirituality is the quality of our relationships. If you want to know how mature you are in the Lord, ask the question, how mature and healthy and reconciled are my relationships with human beings? I think that's a great way of putting into Simple words, what Jesus always said, what the Bible's always said. 1 John 4 puts it this way: if you love God, but hate your brother or sister, you don't love God. You can't love God while you hate your brother and sister, because these are always. These relationships reflect how, in fact, we're doing with our Father. The quality of our relationships that model the reality of our message of agape love.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
I just have a quick question. Isn't Luke 10 the first time we learned that there were more disciples than the 12?
Than just the 12.
And he chose them. So, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, all this time, Jesus has had 12 very, very close disciples. And it doesn't sound or look like he has a lot of contact outside of those 12. And then all of a sudden, he picks 72 others.
Okay.
So it's like, you know what I mean? That's kind of a startling revelation if you put it in context with, going back to, the beginning of the New Testament, where he's, he kind of keeps this inner group, and then all of a sudden, but that's great. I mean, it shows that he had contact with other people.
Yes.
He was, communicating with other people, so he wasn't this loner that we often, kind of, well, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just
absolutely. Yeah.
kind of keep it.
If he wasn't
stay with
introverted,
his
he didn't
homies,
act like
you know what I mean? So it's like.
Yeah. It's funny bringing that up. So I was just thinking that if I had time, would have wanted to talk about, so we will, because you brought it up. Jesus spheres of relationship. Maybe that's how I'll put it. We were just talking about this in class a couple of days. As I read this, the New Testament, I see what I'd say are 5 layers of relationships that Jesus had, moving outward from Jesus in terms of intimacy, in terms of closeness of Jesus. So Jesus at the center, and then Jesus had these 3, Peter, James, and John, that turn up far more frequently in episodes than any of the others. They're there at key moments in Jesus' life, what I would say are sort of climactic moments. Jesus' transfiguration on the mount, things like that. So these 3 seem to be like his best friends. Right? In fact, John eventually thinks of himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. That's what he calls himself in his own gospel. Like, this guy really knew Jesus cared about him. So you got Peter, James, and John, kind of the inner circle. Then you got the 12. Now, why 12? Right? Was it just, well, he just happened to like 12 guys? No, right? 12 is, what's a Jew going to think when you hear 12? 12 tribes of Israel. What did God promise in the new covenant promise of Jeremiah 31? I will restore Israel and Judah, the 10 tribes that were lost and the 2 tribes in the south. He'll restore the 12 tribes. So Jesus chooses 12 disciples to represent the new Israel, the 12 tribes restored. So 12 is a theologically important number for Jesus. That's a fulfillment of a prophetic word. But then he moves on from there. Read, I love Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Because it talks about Jesus on the road and who he's traveling with. And it turns out it's a fascinating group of people. It's some men, it's some women. And some of these women are not who you'd expect a single prophet to be on the road with. It's Mary Magdalene, who was demonized at one point, has been set free. It's, I think Joanna is her name, who is the wife of some guy in Herod's court. So she's on the road with Jesus, and her husband's back over in Herod's employment. So he's traveling with a really ragtag, sort of not what the Pharisees would say is very probably socially acceptable group of people, but these are his friends. Among these are eventually going to be Mary and Martha, 2 women, 2 sisters. So it says he loved them. So Jesus is pouring his life into a whole range of people and loving them where he meets them. Then there's the 72. These are missionaries chosen by Jesus, eventually taught by Jesus. This is the teachings he gives them, and then sent out to bring the kingdom into other towns in Galilee. He's just moving through Galilee, bringing the word of God. And then finally what we call the crowds, kind of last big circle. Often Jesus would just come into a town and just a crowd would gather. And out of that crowd, he might touch several people in terms of healing or this or that, but when you're dealing with a crowd, he can't be intimate with that many. So he's got his intimate circles, and then the crowds that he's ministering to. And that seems to me like a really balanced life. It seems like he knew how to balance intimate friendships with a little wider circle of good friendships, with then how you deal with crowds, and you know you can only touch several. In our culture, where number of friends seem to be so important to people. I talked to some of my Bethel students, a number of Facebook friends, and it's like, how do you do that many friendships? You know. After we're talking about that in class today, and one of my students said, it's almost like our culture gets us to believe that the more friends you have, the better. But what actually is the case, you have to remember, is that quantity and quality are inversely proportional when it comes to friendship, because you only have 24 hours in a day. So you only have a certain amount of relational capacity, whatever that is. You're either going to spread it deep and narrow, or you're going to spread it wide and very shallow. Or you're going to balance it in some way. And I think we see Jesus as balancing it in different kind of contexts like that. That's important. How we do relationships, how we do friendships, how we do marriage, how we do relationships with our siblings, relationships with our children, our parents, is crucial in the kingdom, because our relationships are what models our message. So, go out in twos. Always go out in community. Secondly, it says, so go out 2 by 2. Then, when you come into a town, he says, the first thing he says that they're supposed to do when they come into a new village is speak a blessing. Speak a blessing into people's lives. This is interesting, because as they start moving out through Galilee and eventually into Samaria and the uttermost parts of the world, these are Jewish people who are going into Gentile territory eventually. Last people on earth they've been trained to bless. These good, righteous Jews stay in their territory and don't even want to soil their feet with Samaritan sand. Now Jesus is calling them to eventually move this out and bless wherever they go. Don't judge. See, if I'm going to bless somebody, that means I can't come in and self-righteously judge them at the same time. And human beings love to live on judgment, because the more we judge others, the higher we feel about ourselves. So Jesus is dismantling judgment at this point, saying, go in and just be a blessing. Come under, serve, bleed and die for it if you want. But don't come in and curse with your judgment. Come in and bless with your agape. First thing we do is just to speak blessing into people's lives. If you've time to a little book advertising here, and it's not my book, so you know I actually mean this. Greg's book, Repenting Religion, is, if you haven't read that book, I say put it on your reading list. And if you're not a big reader, just put on your reading list to read the first 2 pages. Greg talks in this book about a time he was sitting in the mall. He's preached on this too. It was the first time God sort of opened Greg's eyes to what's going on in his brain while he's sitting in the mall waiting for his wife Shelley to get done shopping. And he says, I've done this millions of times. He says, I don't like to shop, so I usually sit and quote-unquote people watch. He said, I realized I wasn't watching people. All of a sudden God showed me what was happening in my head as I'm just quote-unquote watching. And it's not just watching, it's judging. Everywhere I look, I'm making assessments in my head about this person and that person and what they look like and what they look like and how they, all these things, he said. I never realized, he said, before I was judging people, I thought I was just watching them. And as soon as I read that and I heard him preach on that, it's like, when I look into my own psyche, I realized I do that all the time. And his challenge in the book, and has been a challenge to me ever since I've read that, is how about we start monitoring our thoughts, just and other people in the room, walking on the hallway at school, at church, and when you realize you're starting to judge someone, assess them in any way, stop, rebuke that thought if necessary, and just speak blessing. Quietly in your heart, just speak blessing to that person. That has probably been the most revolutionary spiritual discipline in my life in the last 10 years, is just noticing that I'm inclined to judge, meaning assess in some way. And what gave me the right to think I'm in the position of assessment? That's God's business, not mine, right? I'm just here to bless and serve and love. And that's a powerful, Jesus tells his disciples. See, it's really hard if you're blessing someone to judge them at the same time.
If we apply that same principle to our view of ourselves, we avoid the situation that you started off the
Absolutely.
conversation with.
Yes. So not just blessing others, but inviting God's blessing into our life as we bless God and others. And put self-assessment even aside. That's absolutely. Because, yeah, if I'm judging others, what I'm really doing at the same time is probably judging myself and hoping I can find some way to sort of get life for me out of putting you in a... Or sometimes we do this, right? In either case, we're back into that pride trap. That's a very good point. Then Jesus says, once you've spoken a blessing over their home or wherever they are, sit and simply eat with them. And he actually adds these words, and eat whatever they put in front of you. Which to you and I might just sound like a good piece of politeness. Not for a Jew. Jews were trained from day one. You do not eat in a whole list of foods, particularly in Gentile territory. And Jesus is saying to Jewish people, eat what they put in front of you. Huge challenge to the Jews. Wait, that's what's kept us separate. Not any longer. What will keep you separate now, set apart, is your heart and your relationships and how you love God and others, not the food you eat and the clothes you wear. Jesus is radically challenging what it looks like to be set apart. Set apart for relationships on their terms.
Wouldn't breaking those rules get you kicked out of the synagogue?
Oh, yeah. In fact, we're going to see just what breaking these rules did for the Apostle Paul a little later tonight. Yeah. A lot of bad 2 years in Jerusalem for saying these very things. After you eat with them, which means, so far, all we're doing is blessing and fellowshipping. Remember, in the ancient world, eating with someone meant, I'm saying to you as whoever I'm eating with, I'm one with you. It was a social statement of identity. In our culture, that doesn't really mean that, but in their culture, it was dishonorable to eat with someone who wasn't of your social status. So if you're above here, you didn't eat with people down here. It's like the Pharisees could never understand why Jesus would eat with tax collectors and sinners. Because it's like, why are you lowering yourself to them? Right? I think what Jesus would have said is, no, I'm not. I'm raising them up. I'm dignifying them. They have value, just like me. Because all this is just social games we play with each other. None of it's true. We're brothers and sisters. Then he says, after you've fellowshiped with them, after you've related to them, now ask the question, how can I not just speak blessing, not just touch them in terms of relationship and talk, but how can I actually bring liberation into their lives? How can I bring healing, freedom from the demonic? Here he literally said, now be willing to cast demons out of people, pray for healing. However you can bring the kingdom to their lives, bring the kingdom. That liberation, that freedom that Jesus came to bring to people's lives. Minister. Just pour yourselves out for them. Then, and only then, does he finally say, oh yes, and proclaim the good news of the kingdom. Now start to talk about it. Like the opposite order of what I grew up in church. For my church, most of the churches I went to, evangelism started with the last step, going out and sharing the gospel, and frequently never bothering to stick around to relate to people, let alone bless and not judge them, let alone eat with them on their terms, in their turf, in their homes, with their food, let alone ask the question, how can I bring liberation into their lives at cost to myself? It was just, I can talk or hand out a tract or here, come to the Billy Graham thing. And I think why Jesus does it this way is because he knows human beings. He knows that it's quite unlikely that unless I've earned the right to be heard, most often people won't listen. And why would they? Right? What he's doing in the first 4 steps is he's earning the right to be heard in the sense that I'm demonstrating my message to you before I tell you it. I'm putting on display the kingdom before I explain it to you. All he does again is, like, I've done the kingdom, now I just have to explain what we just did here. What happened is a community came to you, blessed you, related to you, served you. Now, let me explain that to you. Oh, Jesus. Beautiful way of doing it. Powerful way of doing it. That's why the early church exploded in the next 200 years.
Question.
Yeah.
You know, I work down in downtown Minneapolis, and I know Nicholas, see, and I'm not sure what well, they're saying things from the Bible, they're reading from the Bible, or well, actually, they're not reading from the Bible, they're actually just, talking about the damnation, and you're gonna go to hell, and repent, and it's not that the things that they're saying are wrong, per se, but it seems like that's what they're doing.
Yes, yes.
And if people ignore them, and it actually seems almost poo-poo to me, and I'm a Christian, I feel guilty about it. I feel guilty sometimes, I'm like, Jesus, it sounds like they seem to be weird, and yet I know Christians are not weird, but I'm one. But I have to admit, it seems, and I can't say for sure, but my reaction, if it's typical, I think they actually push people away. I mean, the feeling I get is that it's more of they make it seem like a wacky religion. So it's really an odd thing, and yet I feel some guilt, and I don't want to judge, like we were talking
Sure,
about.
right, yeah.
But it's hard not to.
Yeah.
It's hard not to feel like, guys, that's not hard. You need to get to know people first and really and genuinely care rather than seem like you're just spouting out.
Right.
It's weird. But it seems that this is played out weekly. Once a week, I think these guys are done.
You think it could be under Satan and Satan, to turn people off?
Well, I tell you, that I don't know which folks you're talking about, but there was a group who used to come to the University of Minnesota back in the 80s and 90s, and I saw these folks once, and you know what, it's so easy to get caught up in the judgment on the other side of things, right? But I think there's a difference between what Jesus calls judgment versus we need another word, so I'll use discernment. Jesus never says not to discern things. The way he uses judgment is about judging in order to elevate yourself over someone so that you sort of gain value at the expense of putting them down. But discernment in the kingdom, we have to do that, right? Like, is it wise or not to do this sort of thing? And what I saw this particular group do is they would literally, it sounds like a very similar tactic, but they would like just stand up on some embankment on the view and just wait for some group to walk by and just start, haranguing them. Picking out a young woman, let's say, who wasn't dressed as appropriately as they thought, and actually using derogatory words for her, and then saying, repent. It's like, and the whole thing became, for the university campus, it was a week of laughing at these people, for the most part. And so I felt really like this was a very unfortunate, unwise way to unveil the gospel to people. It certainly didn't seem to be helping anyone. And I suppose from their perspective, well, they're undergoing persecution for the gospel. That's why. But we have to be careful with it, right? All I'm saying is, in terms of discernment, how we want to discern this, is Jesus giving us a model, and if so, are we doing that? This seems to be a model that I see Jesus give. And I'm not saying that means never share the gospel with someone unless you've had time to do all this. Because let's face it, you're on an airplane with someone for an hour. You don't have time, maybe, to go and eat with them and all that stuff, right? This isn't a legalistic formula. But this is a generally wise principle of, if you've got time and you're planning on ministering in a particular area, try to do it this way by building relationship so that when you speak words, there's something that someone can trust.
Say, Paul,
Yeah.
don't you feel that sometimes people avoid being in relationships, casual relationships, for fear of being in a position to judge somebody else? The more that person reveals about themselves, the more you have the ability to judge them. If you listen to their story or their background or where they came from, you find out that this person, used to be on food stamps, or this person, you know what I mean? So, one of the difficulties that I have personally is about my issue of judgment. And so one of the things that's difficult for me is, am I judging, or am I just seeing a contrast between me and another person?
Sure.
Because that's
Sure.
different.
Yes,
It's
it is.
totally different.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's me, and then, and then I'm male, and then I see women, and so sometimes I can be so harsh on myself about judging others.
Yeah.
That I find myself not wanting to involve myself with others because I don't want to be in a position to have to judge them.
Okay.
Well, what if they reveal something that I don't like?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and I think for someone who's been around Woodland for a while and has had this message hammered home, this could be something that someone wrestles with, is, gosh, if the least I know of someone, the least knowledge I have, that I could actually use for judging them. So ironically, it could actually cause you to distance from people, right? So I think there's got to be, again, a way then, because I don't think Greg, I certainly don't think God would mean that the way not to judge is to keep away from people. But there's a principle there that would say, how do I get involved in people's lives, and therefore get on the inside of them, start to know them a little better, without falling into that natural, excuse me, that natural pattern we find ourselves. And I think that the answer is going to be something along the lines of, well, that's a big part of what we call spiritual warfare, right? Is thoughts in my mind are there naturally. The more I know about somebody, the more data I have to compare, and then to compare not just in sort of a neutral way, but in this judging way. And so I just got to be, as Kevin Callaghan frequently will say, a detective of my brain. I can't ever put this on autopilot, because if I put it on autopilot, I'll probably go where my sinful bent will take me. But the Spirit of God's going to be, to stay monitoring what is going on up here. Never go on autopilot, but continuing to, what Apostle Paul says, take every thought captive to Jesus Christ. And as I do that, I can begin to train myself under the guidance of the Spirit, train myself in righteousness. Right? Righteousness, just a covenant term that means rightly related. What it means to be rightly related to someone I don't even know but see is to not think thoughts about them that are not becoming of their status as a creature of God who loves them. And the closer I get to someone, there's more involved now in what it means to love them. But it's still the same thing, never to do this in order to get life from them. So it's a good challenge.
I find the reverse of that is true too, where in my own life, I find that I don't want to build relationship with people who I feel judged by.
Oh, okay.
What do you think about that? Because that's a hard one too.
Sure. Yeah. She said there's also the kind of reverse side, which is she struggles with wanting to build relationships or getting close with people who she feels judged by.
And then I don't want to. Like,
Right.
I don't want anything to do with them.
Right.
I hate that feeling.
Of being,
But what's the Christian response to that?
right.
Because sometimes I fail, sometimes I go for it, sometimes I fail. What is the right thing to do?
Sure. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think so many times, again, we wonder if we could have formulas on these things. But instead what we get is basic principles of relationship. And then we're called by the Spirit's power to apply those principles in different contexts with different people. I think a basic principle would be that if someone's judging you, someone's judging any of us, that is not a healthy context for a relationship. And if that is going to be a healthy relationship, that act of judgment towards you would have to, out of love for the other person and care for the relationship, would have to be confronted. And so I think it's very, again, you want to submit this to God in prayer, but like everything. But I would imagine if that relationship is at all to be salvaged, it would have to be a word of loving confrontation that here's how you make me feel. Now, you might be misinterpreting, right? But that would give them a chance to explain that. Or, if it's a kingdom moment, it might give them a chance to repent. In either case, there's going to be clarity of what happened. So much, I think, around covenant relationships are the fact that we don't talk about our relationships with each other. We assume, we imply, we wonder, and there's so much brokenness that can happen when there's not that communication. Particularly for us in Minnesota, we're stoic, passive Minnesota niceness. It becomes quickly passive-aggressive when that's just kind of how we do things, right? And if it gets so tense, we just finally just never really talk to each other again. So it's challenging to have those difficult conversations. Okay, so Jesus pours into these people for several years. The group grows from 12 to 70, and he just keeps raising people up as he's ministering and sending them out on mission and training them. And then Jesus begins to say these troubling words to this group. First time he starts to mention this. First time we see it is usually in the middle, around the middle of each gospel, where Jesus has been doing all this great stuff and bringing in the kingdom, and also he pulls his 12 aside and says, look, here's the deal. This is good. We're going to keep doing this, but we got to go to Jerusalem now because I got to die. Talk about cold shower on the, Jesus, no, this is going good, right? His disciples, as they start this journey now, this last journey to Jerusalem, he keeps trying to kind of bring them in on the loop. I've got to die. Well, yes, that sounds bad, but look, I'll rise in 3 days. I've got to die. And Peter at one point rebukes him for even bringing the idea up, and Jesus has to turn to Peter and say, get behind me, adversary. Same word we use for Satan. They're on the road again. He'll head toward Jerusalem, and Peter and the disciples just they can't imagine why this would have to be the case. Because a dead Messiah in their mind is no good. Messiah is a victorious political ruler, not a dead criminal on a cross. They don't have the categories for that. So Jesus starts walking this final journey to Jerusalem at Passover. When he gets to Jerusalem, we're told that what we call in the tradition the triumphal entry happens. Jesus entering into Jerusalem. Now, see, the way it was supposed to be, at least in the Jewish mind, was Messiah would come. He'd come to Jerusalem, which was the city of God, which was where the Messiah was supposed to be king. And he would go in, and he'd go into the temple, because the Son of God, David's descendant, built the temple, Solomon. And the new Son of God, David's Messiah descendant, would come in and cleanse it, and set up the right kingdom, and get Rome out, and this would be like, finally, Israel would be back in power. Jesus does this, at least it looks like he's going to. He gets to Jerusalem. A lot of people are following him because they've heard about Lazarus' resurrection. According to John, that's what got this real crowd started around this time. And they put him on a donkey, because it says in Zechariah 9:9 that this final king will enter Jerusalem on a donkey, a foal of a donkey. And he does, he gets on it, he's riding in. And he goes to the temple, just like he's supposed to. But in Mark puts it this way. And Jesus went to the temple, looked around, turned around, and left the city. It's about as anticlimactic a moment for a reigning king as you can imagine. Jesus comes in, looks around, doesn't do anything, but heads back out and says, in fact, it says in Mark, he will not, the whole rest of the week, will not sleep in the city. Every night he leaves the city, goes out to the Mount of Olives, and stays outside the city gates. This is a huge commentary. When you realize Jesus is Yahweh, Yahweh comes in, it's not just a Messiah. It is Messiah, but it's not just Messiah. It is Yahweh God. He comes into his temple to find what he hopes would be authentic worship, and he sees what he sees. So his presence can't dwell there. So he leaves. He goes out, he can't even stay in his own city. Yahweh God has to leave. It's a statement of judgment. It's a statement that things have gotten so bad that when God comes back to find his people, once again, they are not ready for him.
Well, was that where he got angry and turned over the...
Okay, day 2 now. Wakes up the next morning, second day. Starts walking into the city. So here's his pattern for the rest of the week. He'll go into the city in the morning and do some stuff, and as soon as night comes, he'll head back out and sleep outside the city, out on Mount of Olives. So it's day 2. He starts walking into the city with his disciples. They'll think, oh, maybe now he's going to finally get this act together. As he's walking in, he sees a fig tree in the distance. Mark puts this little interesting phrase on there. He says, Jesus went into the fig tree to look for figs. But then Mark adds, but there were no figs, for it was not yet the season for figs. Now, either Jesus forgot what season it was, or he's being very angry with the fig tree for not producing crops in the winter, which would be silly, because Jesus is a pretty reasonable guy. Or something prophetic and symbolic is going on there. I propose it's the last option. Right? Remember, in the Old Testament, Israel is frequently depicted as a fig tree, or the one who is it's God's garden, God's fig tree. What he's saying is, like this fig tree that doesn't have any fruit on it, so my people Israel have no fruit. And so what he does is he curses the fig tree, and it withers up and dies. This is a prophetic, symbolic action of what's coming for Israel. But if we don't know this, that this was like Jesus got angry with a fig tree one day and kind of lost his temper. No, this is a prophetic action.
Could that also say something about the season that Israel was not in?
Interesting. Perhaps. Yeah. I'm told that in Jewish tradition there was this idea that when Messiah came, that everything should be bearing fruit, trees and everything. And so there could also be this idea that both the people and even the land, the trees itself, should be ready for Messiah, and they weren't. And so he curses the fig tree. As soon as he does that, curses the fig tree, continues on, and marches right into the temple. And then what does he do? Now he looks like he gets pretty angry. He starts turning over tables, it says. In one of the accounts it says he takes a whip and starts driving the animals out of it. He sees money changers as opposed to a house of prayer. And we often call this cleansing the temple. This is the act when Jesus cleansed the temple. John does describe it that way, but I think there's more going on. Scholars today just call it Jesus' temple action, like he did this act in the temple. Then we're left to say, what did it mean? Most scholars today think it wasn't just Jesus actually trying to make things better in the temple. What he was doing is he was symbolically destroying the temple. Okay? Now, he was turning these things over and driving the animals out as a small little indicator of what was to come in the future. And in fact, he was right, because within a generation, the Romans came in and they took everything down. They left one partial wall standing, right, the western wall. But they just decimated the city. So what Jesus was doing is he was showing symbolically, here's what happens when my people do not worship. They lose their protective blessing of God, and the enemy comes in. And so he's really demonstrating prophetically what's about to happen without repentance on their part. At the end of the day, John walks back out and sleeps outside of the city. He does this, again, for an entire week. And frequently now, the rest of the days, his time is spent in confrontation with religious leaders. Pharisees, some of the time, Sadducees, for some of the time. They realize this man is a following. They realize he's done some pretty bold actions in their temple. And they start now to plot against him. But they have to be careful, because he's got a significant following. And it's at Passover time. You never know what's going to happen at Passover. That the city just swelled with all these incoming pilgrims at this time. And it was just like a tinderbox waiting to go up in smoke. Pilate would come in from the coast where he usually lived, would actually come and live in the city during Passover. And he would bring a garrison of battalion of soldiers down from Syria, would station them in Jerusalem during the Passover week, just because he knew how hot things could get. So this was the time. Pilate's there, the soldiers are there, Jesus is there, the religious leaders are feeling all this tension, and they're trying to figure out what to do about this. So at first they just start to argue with Jesus in public, because one way to take care of a movement is to shame the leader of a movement publicly. And if you shame them bad enough, their followers will just go, this is a dishonorable guy, and they'll stop following. So they try to do this to Jesus. They try to catch him in little public debates, and he wins every time. Never hurts to be the son of God when you're in a debate. He just wins all the time. And finally, the end of the week comes, and now it's coming near Passover. And Jesus celebrates Passover now, what we call the Last Supper, with his disciples. That beautiful moment when Jesus washes their feet, the Lord serving, showing them what real leadership looks like. In the midst of the meal, he holds up the cup of, what he says is the cup of the new covenant. The new covenant in my blood, he says. Do this from this day forward in remembrance of me. Breaks the bread. Do this, as whenever you do it, as often as you do it in remembrance of me. What he's doing is he's showing us the sign now of the new covenant. Every covenant has a physical, visible, ongoing reminder in the physical realm of what's true in the spiritual realm. And so this death that we can't really see what it does in the spiritual realm, he's showing us with these elements that we can remember and bring to remembrance together the act of his loving self-sacrifice for us with this new covenant ceremony. And today, to this day, we use it. 2,000 years later, celebrate the Lord's Supper to remember what Jesus has done.
Isn't there something about the, it says after supper, to
Yes.
make a cup.
Yes.
And in the Jewish tradition, that cup had a certain meaning, right? Or
Yeah.
symbolism.
Yeah, and
I can't remember.
I don't remember either.
It's the cup of redemption.
Redemption?
Cup.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I remember when you look at and you correlate the traditional Jewish Passover with what Jesus is doing, some really interesting things. So it's cup of redemption. It had a lot to connect there.
In the Jewish tradition, the matzah that presumed broke, the third matzah was the symbolized the Messiah.
Yeah, powerful, powerful stuff. It says in one of the Gospels that after they finished eating, they sang a hymn, and then eventually left and went to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus ended up praying for the final rest. So, each of the four Gospels, near the end, come to this final moment of betrayal by Judas, arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, several trials that Jesus gets put on over the next 24 hours. He's brought before Pilate, well, first before the Sanhedrin, before the Jews. But see, the Jews now, remember, they're under Roman rule. So because they're under Roman rule, the Jews can't execute anybody. The only one who can execute someone is the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. So they first bring him up on charges amongst the Jews for blasphemy, but then they realize Pilate doesn't care about their religion or blasphemy that much. They got to find a political reason that he's going to get upset about. Well, they got one ready made. This guy sort of thinks he's Messiah, and Messiah is king, and king is a political term. So that one they can bring to Pilate as a political reason why he should be concerned about Jesus. And so they bring him to Pilate. Pilate isn't convinced that this guy poses a threat, and so he's looking for a way to pass the buck. And remembers that Herod Antipas, who governs Galilee, is down in Jerusalem because it's Passover. And that Jesus is from Galilee. So he says, hey, you're Galilean. Don't even live down here. I'll send you to Herod. He'll decide what to do. So they take Jesus to Herod. And Herod, it says, has been waiting for this. Like, he's been hearing about this guy who does these miracles. So he says, do a miracle for me. Like Jesus is some dog and pony show or something. And Jesus doesn't, for most of the stuff, Jesus doesn't say a word. And he said nothing. He did not open his mouth. And so he didn't do his little trick for Herod. So Herod said, hey, I might be governor of Galilee, but we're in Judea now. So go back to Pilate, let him handle this. So they're just shuffling Jesus back and forth. And finally Pilate, the famous words, he washes his hands, but he says that he's got a problem. He doesn't want the Jews upset on one hand, yet he doesn't see this man as a criminal on the other. What are you going to do? Well, you give the Jews the option of voting between him and Barabbas. Which one to set free? And the crowds scream for Barabbas to be set free, who probably was a zealot, probably was someone who, the word thief, that often gets translated thief, like the two thieves that Jesus was crucified with. That word lestai, that we translate thief, could mean just a common thief, but also could mean someone who was a political zealot, a revolutionary, who would rob from rich Galilean Jews, or rich Jews, and then try to share with the poor, more like a Robin Hood sort of figure. There was a political. So these are probably political people who had taken the stance that we need to be violent against Rome. And so they're political criminals. Because you didn't crucify just your average thief. The cross was for political criminals. It was a horrendous death. And pretty much saved for those that Rome thought was a threat to it. So probably Barabbas, probably the two criminals that crucified next to Jesus were political criminals. Jesus, they cried for his death. And so, and it's funny, in most of these texts of our Gospels, it simply says, and they crucified him. It's so short. But, this was as brutal a death as as you can imagine. The whole reason Romans used this was a political scare tactic. This was what you did to people, and once you did it to some of them, the rest knew never mess with Rome again. Because the last thing you want to do is end up on a cross of Rome. The whole event was shameful because of usually you were crucified naked. The way you died was slow and painful. It was just a wonderful way, a wonderful tool by which to keep a population under control. So this is what Jesus went through for us. Usually we start out with someone being whipped, scourged, with a cat o' nine tails, a leather whip with leather strands with rock or bone or metal embedded in the leather. Frequently, some people didn't make it through that alive. They lost so much blood and went into shock, you could actually die from being scourged. Those who made it through that would then carry their own crossbeam to the crucifixion site, so they'd carry the cross part, and then they'd nail that to the upright once they got there. And again, the way they would crucify is, frequently you'll see in the palms, but that wasn't how they would do it, because the palm would rip right through the skin there. They'd have to go through the wrist so the bones would hold. And then we actually found a crucifixion victim from the 1st century in a burial site over in Jerusalem in 1968, and the spike was still in it, and it was through the tarsals and then through the wrists. So they found a way to do that where they wouldn't hit any arteries, because you don't want this person to die. They made it through the scourging. You want them to live for a while on the cross to let their neighbors see just what happened. So they usually do that, and again, the crosses weren't that high. They were not that far off the ground, really. And there was different models of them. Some were like our traditional cross, some were like this, some were actually X-shaped. There was different models that used in different times. But again, the theory was you can actually affix someone to the wood, and they can live that way for days sometimes. And the way you die on a cross isn't loss of blood, because they do that right. They know where to do that. The way you die on a cross is you get so weak after a while that you can't breathe. Because when you're in this position hanging, the only way you can exhale is if you pull yourself up on the nails. Then you go, and then you slump back down, and you can take a breath in, but you can't breathe out. When it's all the weight is pushing down, you have to pull up to breathe out. And so they would literally talk about these criminals, these people on these crosses moving up and down on the cross for days as they're trying to breathe. And finally, when you're so weak, you can't pull up anymore, you just asphyxiate. It's brutal. Now, for the Jews, it was different. Because for the Jews, they had a law that said you cannot keep someone on a tree or a cross overnight. And so the Romans actually honored the Jewish law because they didn't want the Jews to rebel. So the Jews had this special dispensation from Romans. They would only put them on the cross for one day. At the end of the day, they would come and take a mallet and break their legs, because then they couldn't push up, and then they would die within a matter of minutes. So the Jews had it sort of a little easier, because in other parts of the empire, they would sometimes be 4 or 5 days before they died. We know that they came to Jesus, and they didn't have to break his legs, because Jesus was already had expired, had already died in about 6 hours on the cross. The other 2 criminals, Jesus passed away before that. Saw an article once in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2 doctors, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, who did a kind of a modern analysis of what they would diagnose Jesus' death as. And they said that the clearest they could come is myocardial infarction, an actual heart attack, because they took that from the fact that he died before, even within 6 hours, and that the stress his body had been under. They looked all the way back to the fact that he had sweated blood in the garden, a condition known as hematopoiesis, in which the capillaries of the skin break under severe stress and can actually leak into the sweat glands, and then it looks like you're sweating blood. So already the body's under severe stress there. Then you go through the scourgings that he went through, and then the crucifixion, and it's just that his heart gave out before he even needed to have his legs broken. And they even said that when John's description of the spear going into his side to make sure he was dead, that clear liquid came out first, John said, and then blood. And they said, actually, that makes sense from the kind of condition they're talking about, that the pericardium around the heart would have enlarged with this clear serum, and that would have been the first thing that got punctured, so clear fluid would have come out, then hitting the heart and the blood coming out. So they said it's actually a pretty accurate medical diagnosis of what likely would have happened.
Well, there's a lot of controversy about whether he was, his hands were pierced or his wrists were pierced. But in John 20, the disciple, he points to his hand,
Oh,
you know, where he was nailed,
Yeah.
and to his side.
okay.
So,
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see what the
I'm just
Greek
a
is
stickler
there.
for little details like that, but I don't.
Yeah, those are the kind of things where translations are really an interesting question. Like, did the Greek word for whatever it was there encompass this whole area, or was it like stopping there? And that's a good question. I think what would have happened, we do know this happens sometimes. If they would have done it here, then they probably would have also tied it with rope, his arms, upper arms, so that it wouldn't rip through. It would actually, we do have some evidence there was sometimes rope was used as well to hold the body in place. In any case, Jesus dies on the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, a leader in the Jewish Sanhedrin, actually asked for his body. Apparently a man who lived in Jerusalem there. Remember, Jesus' family is all up north of Galilee. They're just down here for the Passover. And so this Sanhedrin member, who's apparently become a follower of Jesus, asks for his body and gives him private burial in his own family tomb. Which, what we know would have happened otherwise is usually criminals who were crucified were just thrown in a common shallow grave. Just their bodies taken and just dumped. There was no honor done to the body. But this was actually taken by a friend of Jesus and given a decent burial in his family tomb. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll pick it up here. Finish our look at the Gospels.